Title: The River's Wrath. Chapter 1: The Return to Edisto. Zack hadn't meant to return to Edisto. The land, the river, it had haunted him, twisted his mind with memories of loss and fear, and he had buried those memories deep, far away from this place. But now, standing on the banks of the river again, those memories flooded back like a dam breaking. He could almost hear the whispers beneath the surface, the soft murmurs that had always been there, hidden, patient, waiting. The river lay before him, its dark surface rippling as if it were alive, a silent invitation that Zack knew he should have resisted. The trees loomed tall and twisted along its banks, their limbs reaching out like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The branches twisted and writhed as if alive, bending with the weight of years of suffering, contorted by some unseen force. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath, watching him with unseen eyes, waiting for him to cross the threshold into its depths. Zack's throat tightened, and his hands clenched at his sides. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the memory of that day, the day everything changed, the cold, the darkness, the suffocating silence when Daniel had gone under and Zack had been unable to pull him out. The river had taken his brother, and it had never given him back. "You all right, man?" Jordan's voice pulled Zack from the haze of memories, but it only made his discomfort worse. Jordan's voice was light, carefree, but there was an edge to it, an edge that Zack hadn't missed. He knew his friend could sense something was wrong, could feel the tension in the air, the way the land itself seemed to stir with the old, familiar malevolence. "I'm fine," Zack muttered, but the words were hollow, empty. He felt like a fool for even trying to lie to himself. He wasn't fine. He would never be fine here. Jordan didn't seem convinced. He glanced back at Zack, concern flashing in his eyes. "Come on, man. It's just a river. The water's calm. Nothing to be afraid of." But that was just it. Zack wasn't afraid of the river. He was afraid of what it had become, what it had always been. The land here was cursed, old with a hunger so deep that it had swallowed not just his brother, but the souls of anyone foolish enough to venture too close. He had always known that there was something wrong about Edisto, something that whispered to him in his nightmares. And yet, here he was, standing on its banks again, as if he hadn't learned anything. Zack pushed the thought aside. "No, I'm not going back there." He took a deep breath and turned to face the river again, pretending to calm his racing thoughts. But the air around him felt too thick, too heavy. It pressed against his chest like a weight, suffocating him, making his heart beat harder in his ribs. He could feel the presence of something unseen, something ancient, hanging in the air. It was watching him, waiting. "Zack, come on, let's get in the boat," Madison called from behind him, her voice bright and encouraging, but it seemed distant, like she was speaking from a place Zack couldn't quite reach. Zack turned, his gaze flicking toward her, and then to the water. The others were already in their tubes, already moving, trusting that the river would be their peaceful retreat for the day. But Zack felt the pull of the river more acutely than he ever had before. The water was inviting, yes, but it was also watching. He could feel it in his bones, in the pit of his stomach. He should have said no. He should have turned around and left this cursed place behind. But instead, he forced his legs to move, one foot after the other, until his feet hit the water. The chill seeped through his shoes, making his body shiver with the cold of the river's touch. His eyes locked onto the dark, murky water as it swirled around his legs. The pull of it was subtle at first, just the tiniest of tugs on his body, as though the river had noticed him again, remembering him. The others were oblivious, laughing and joking, too wrapped up in the excitement of the tubing adventure to notice. But Zack knew better. His mind was screaming, telling him to turn back, to get away before it was too late. But no matter how loud the warning in his head became, he pushed it aside and climbed into the boat. He told himself it was just the old memories creeping in. Nothing more. Nothing but the lingering echoes of a childhood nightmare. The boat pushed off the shore with a soft scraping sound. As they drifted further from the bank, Zack's eyes scanned the water, watching the shifting ripples beneath the surface. His fingers tightened around the paddle, and for a moment, it was as though the air itself had thickened, the very space around them tightening, making it difficult to breathe. "You're fine," he whispered to himself. "You're just imagining things." But even as the words left his lips, he could feel it, the unmistakable pressure in the air, the shifting sensation beneath his feet. The river had come alive again, and it was calling him back. The forest closed in around them, the trees above casting long, twisted shadows across the water. The air was growing heavier, the sounds of the forest dampening with each passing minute. The water was calm, too calm. The silence stretched out, thick and oppressive, as if the very world was holding its breath, waiting. Zack tried to shake off the rising dread, focusing instead on the gentle rocking of the boat as they glided downstream. He could hear the faint chatter of his friends, but it seemed far away, muffled, as if the sound were being absorbed by the thickening air. His eyes darted to the trees, their dark shapes looming over the water like silent sentinels, their branches twisting, bending, reaching out with fingers that seemed far too long, too unnatural. Suddenly, the wind picked up, sending a chill through his body. The leaves rustled, but there was something different in the sound. Something wrong. The whispers were back. They were louder now, swirling in his mind, rising from the river's depths, too soft to make out, but unmistakable in their insistent pull. "Come closer," they seemed to say. "It's waiting for you." Zack froze. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as his eyes locked on the water. The surface had become darker, murkier. The sun, barely visible through the dense canopy, cast strange, distorted shadows across the surface. But there was something else. A shape. Something moving just beneath the water, far too large to be a fish, far too wrong. It shifted, just out of view, but Zack could feel it, the presence of something massive, watching them. The boat rocked suddenly, sending a shock of adrenaline through Zack's body. His pulse raced, his breath coming faster. He turned toward the others, but Jordan and Madison were still laughing, unaware of the danger that loomed so close. They couldn't hear it. They couldn't feel the way the river had changed, the way the land had shifted, waiting for them. The whispers became clearer, their words insistent, almost pleading. "Come closer. It has begun." And then the water shifted. A ripple, too large to be natural, rose from the depths, the surface breaking with a violent splash. Zack gasped, his body stiffening, his fingers frozen around the paddle. And there it was, the serpent. Its massive head breached the water, its yellow eyes glowing like twin suns, watching Zack with an unnerving hunger. The creature's body coiled beneath the surface, its length stretching far beyond the river's edge. The land had awakened, and so had its guardian. Zack's blood ran cold as the river's whispers crescendoed into a roar of hungry anticipation. And suddenly the air grew still again, but not in peace. This was the stillness of waiting, the calm before the storm. Chapter 2. The River's Whisper. The boat drifted silently through the darkening water, the soft splashing of paddles the only sound that filled the thickening air. Zack sat at the front, his eyes never straying far from the rippling surface beneath him. It was a river he had known well as a child, its flow once a comforting companion, its banks a playground of adventure. But now, as they ventured deeper into its heart, the river had become something else, something darker, more sinister. He could feel it in the weight of the air, thick and oppressive. The trees that lined the banks loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching overhead in grotesque shapes, as though reaching for something just out of their grasp. Their bare limbs seemed to claw at the sky, and every gust of wind sent a shiver through the dense canopy, as if the forest itself were trembling. The sun, once high and bright, was now a faint memory, swallowed by the ever-thickening fog that rolled in from the depths of the river. Zack's heart beat steadily in his chest, but he could hear it, the faintest whisper in the wind, like a voice calling his name, though there was no one to speak. He brushed it off, shaking his head. It was just his mind playing tricks on him, a result of the tension that had been building since they first pushed off the shore. But the whisper, the way it seemed to slither through the trees, around the water, it felt wrong. His friends, Jordan and Madison, were laughing in the back of the boat, unaware of the creeping sense of dread that had begun to coil in Zach's chest. They were caught up in the excitement, the thrill of the adventure, and Zach could almost envy them for it. How easy it was for them to laugh and joke, their voices carefree as the river carried them along. But Zach couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He had felt it ever since they had crossed into the deeper stretches of the river, where the trees grew closer, their trunks gnarled and knotted with age. The water had grown darker here, the once clear flow of the river now a murky black, and with every paddle stroke, the current seemed to pull them farther into the shadows. "Come on, Zach." Madison's voice broke through his thoughts, light and teasing. "Stop being so serious. It's just a river." Zach forced a smile, though it felt strange on his face, as if his muscles had forgotten how to do it. "Yeah, I know. Just a little weird being back here, I guess." Jordan chuckled from the back, his voice light. "You're overthinking it. Just relax. Remember when we were kids and we used to play here all the time? Nothing's changed." But something had changed. The air was different now, more oppressive. The water was no longer the playful companion of his childhood, but a living, breathing entity, watchful, waiting, hungry. As they drifted further down the river, the whispers grew louder. Not from the wind, not from the trees, but from below, from the water. Zach's fingers tightened around the paddle. He wasn't imagining it. He could hear them now, faint but clear. Voices, muffled beneath the surface, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The sound was distant, yet somehow so close, like they were whispering directly into his ear. "Come closer." Zach's breath caught in his throat. He turned quickly to look at Jordan and Madison, but they were too busy splashing each other with water to notice. The river didn't care for them the way it cared for him. Zach knew this now. It had always been like this. The river knew him, and it had never forgotten. You can't escape. Zach's pulse quickened. His heart thudded in his chest, drowning out the faint murmurings from the water. He could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on him, a presence in the air that seemed to sink into his bones, whispering his name. The same way it had always whispered when he was a child. Only now, it wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. Come closer. It wasn't the river that he was afraid of anymore. It was what the river had become. The serpent, the guardian, the curse. "Hey, Zach, you okay?" Madison's voice pierced through his growing panic, and he realized he had been holding his breath. He let it out slowly, willing his racing heart to slow. "I'm fine," he said. But even to his own ears it sounded strained, unnatural. He forced a smile again. "Just thinking about things." "Uh-huh," Jordan said with a grin, his paddle slicing through the water. "What, you thinking about those ghost stories you used to tell when we were kids?" Zach didn't answer, but the memories flooded back, the way they used to sit on the riverbank, daring each other to dip their toes into the water at night, when the air was thick and the river felt like it was watching them. They'd always laugh it off, but Zach had never been able to shake the feeling that there was something out there, something waiting for them. And the way the river's current had always seemed to push back, as if it were alive, had unsettled him even then. But now, it was different. He wasn't a child anymore. He was an adult, and he had to face the truth of what he was feeling. And that truth was that the river wasn't just alive, it was aware of him, aware of them all. Suddenly, the boat jolted, throwing Zach off balance. He grabbed the side to steady himself, his heart leaping into his throat. The water beneath them had shifted, churning as if something massive had moved beneath the surface. Zach's breath caught and he glanced at the others. "What the hell was that?" Jordan said, his voice more serious now, the playful tone gone. "I didn't feel anything," Madison said, her voice still light, but with a hint of uncertainty creeping in. Zach's eyes flicked to the water again, searching for the source of the disturbance. The surface was rippling, as if something had moved just below. But there was nothing, no sign of anything unusual. Yet the feeling remained, crawling at the back of his mind. "Did you see that?" Zach asked, his voice tight. Jordan shrugged, not sensing the weight of Zach's words. "It's just the current. Maybe a fish or something." But Zach didn't believe that. The water was different now. It wasn't just a current. It wasn't a fish. It was Something else. Something ancient. Something waiting. The boat glided farther into the darkening stretch of the river, the forest growing thicker around them. The trees pressed in like the walls of a tunnel, their shadows creeping ever closer. The wind died down, and for a moment, there was nothing but the eerie stillness, the unnatural calm that hung over them like a shroud. And then, just as suddenly, the whispers returned. Come closer. Zach's fingers curled around the paddle with a white-knuckled grip. The sound wasn't coming from the trees or the wind. It was coming from the water itself. The river was calling to him, pulling at something deep within him, a primal fear that had always been there, lying dormant, waiting for the right moment to wake. He wanted to turn around, to get out of the water, to leave this place. But the pull was too strong. The river was alive, and it was waking. The water churned again, and this time, Zach saw it, a dark shape, just beneath the surface, rippling in the depths. Its massive form was barely visible, but the movement was unmistakable. Zach's breath caught in his throat. It was real. It had always been real, and it was coming for them. Treat a few times to be continued. In the next chapter, Zach and his friends will encounter the terrifying truth of the river, the ancient force that watches and waits. They will come face to face with the serpent, the guardian of the river, and the curse that binds them to its deadly current. The horror is only beginning, and the water's grip will tighten around them, pulling them into the depths. Chapter 3. The hunt begins. The water around them seemed to breathe, the soft gurgling of the river an unsettling rhythm, almost too methodical, as if it were alive and aware of every movement. Zach's eyes remained locked on the shifting surface ahead of him, his hand gripping the paddle so tightly his knuckles ached. He tried to steady his breath, but it was impossible. The air was thick, oppressive, every inhalation coming with the weight of an unseen presence. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown louder, more insistent, until the sound of them had become a constant in his mind, a buzzing hum in the back of his skull, making his head throb with discomfort. Jordan and Madison were still laughing, their voices light and carefree, a desperate attempt to push away the creeping unease that had settled over Zach like a cold shroud. They didn't feel it. They didn't see the danger. And he couldn't bring himself to say what he knew was coming. It's already here. Zach's gaze flicked to the water again, watching as the surface rippled unnaturally. It wasn't the calm, lazy current he had remembered. It was darker now, too dark. The water wasn't just reflecting the dying light of the sun. It absorbed it, sucking everything into its depths. There was something hidden there, something that moved, unseen and unknowable, beneath the surface. He could feel its weight, the silent pressure it exerted from the depths. The whispers intensified. Come closer. Come to the water. Zach's grip on his paddle tightened, his knuckles turning white. He wasn't sure if it was the river calling him or something else, but it felt as though the land itself, the very earth beneath his feet, had a grip on him, pulling him deeper into its embrace. Zach, what's wrong with you? Madison's voice cut through his growing panic, but her words felt distant, like they were coming from far away. He couldn't focus on her now. The water was calling louder, and Zach could feel his pulse quicken, a cold sweat breaking out across his skin. I don't know, Zach muttered, his voice strained. It's just, there's something wrong with the river. It's not what I remembered. Jordan laughed, though his tone was now tinged with uncertainty. Come on, dude, stop being paranoid. It's just the current messing with your head. But it wasn't just the current. Zach knew that. He knew that. He had always known that something about the river had been wrong, even as a child, but it had taken him years to face it, to accept the truth, that the river was no ordinary body of water. It was a thing alive, and it had taken things before, people, and it would do so again. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the water, a violent disturbance that made the boat lurch. Zach's heart skipped a beat, and he nearly lost his balance. He turned just in time to see a massive ripple break the surface of the water. It wasn't a wave caused by wind or some natural movement. It was something else. Something massive, pushing against the current. A shadow, too large to be a fish, too fluid to be any creature he knew. Did you see that? Zach's voice was sharp, his heart hammering in his chest. But when he turned toward his friends, he saw that they were still oblivious, too caught up in their own world to see the danger that loomed just beneath the surface. "What?" Madison asked, turning her head toward Zach, her voice light, confused. "I saw something in the water," Zach said, his eyes darting back to the river, searching for any sign of the creature. But the water had returned to its unnerving calmness, the shadows beneath the surface barely noticeable now. "Come on, man," Jordan said, shaking his head, clearly unimpressed. "You're scaring yourself. There's nothing out there. You're just there." A dark shape broke the surface again, this time closer, much closer. The ripples were followed by the unmistakable outline of something enormous, its head breaking the water with a loud, deafening crash that made the boat rock violently. Zach's heart dropped to his stomach as he watched in horror, his breath caught in his throat. The creature's eyes were the first thing he saw, bright, glowing yellow, fixed directly on him. There was no mistaking the malevolence in them. It was ancient. It was hungry. "Holy shit!" Jordan's voice broke through the tension, and Zach saw the color drain from his friend's face. But the moment of clarity was short-lived. The creature's massive body began to rise from the water, and Zach could see the full length of it. The serpent's body coiled like a great black snake, stretching impossibly long, its scales glistening with a dark sheen. Its jaw opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, each one as long as Zach's arm, gleaming in the fading light. The boat lurched again as the serpent surged forward, its body twisting through the water like a living nightmare. The force of it sent waves crashing into them, knocking Madison into the water with a scream. "Madison!" Zach shouted, reaching out for her, but the current was too strong. The serpent's body moved in such a way that it pulled the river itself, as if the land had conspired to drag her under. Madison's head bobbed in the water, her eyes wide with terror. Her screams were muffled by the rush of the water, but Zach could see the horror on her face, the way she reached out for the boat, unable to grasp it. The serpent moved again, its tail striking the water like a whip, sending a wave of power that tossed Zach off his tube. The world spun as he plunged beneath the water's surface, and for a split second, everything went dark. The cold was suffocating. He felt his lungs burning for air as he fought to push himself back to the surface. But the water was thick, heavier now, like it was pushing back against him. The weight of it pressed on him from all sides, like the very river was trying to pull him into its depths. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent. "Come, join us." Zach's head broke the surface with a gasp, and his eyes shot immediately toward where Madison had fallen. She was gone. Her desperate cry had been swallowed by the river, and now the surface was still again, the place where she had vanished eerily calm. No. Zach's chest tightened, his body shaking from the cold and the terror that had seized him. He turned frantically to look at Jordan, but his friend had already been pulled under. The serpent had claimed them both. All that remained was Zach, alone in the water, his mind spinning with confusion and dread. The land had been waiting. The river had always been waiting. "You belong to me now." The voice echoed in his mind, and Zach's limbs went cold. He struggled to stay afloat, but it was useless. The serpent's presence filled the air around him, thick with the weight of an ancient hunger that refused to be denied. Suddenly, a shadow loomed beneath him, a dark, undulating shape in the water, and then the serpent's head shot forward again. Its massive, gaping maw opened wide, and Zach felt the river pulling him toward it, as though it were dragging him into the heart of the beast. The serpent was not just hunting, it was feasting. Zach gasped, his fingers scraping against the surface of the water, but he was trapped in the serpent's wake. The river had him, and there was no escaping it. The water surged beneath him, and as the serpent's jaws closed around him, Zach knew one thing for certain. He was no longer a survivor. He was just another sacrifice. Chapter 4. Into the Maw. The river had swallowed everything. Zach, his fears, his friends, and now it was swallowing his very sanity. He was alone. Or at least, that's what he wanted to believe. But it didn't feel like he was alone. The water was no longer the familiar current of his childhood, but a force that seemed alive, twisting and pulling him deeper into its grip. The trees along the banks of the river were no longer silent witnesses to the flow of time. Their gnarled, twisted limbs had become dark, reaching arms, clawing at the sky, as if trying to pull the very clouds into the murky water. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as though the land itself was alive with a hunger that echoed from the depths of the river, stretching long across the water like a shadow that never quite reached the shore. The air felt different, thick. The stillness that had settled around him was suffocating, as though the river was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But Zack could feel it, the unsettling pressure on his chest, like an unseen weight pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. It was as though the river was watching him. And then there were the whispers. They had started faintly at first, like the distant murmur of wind through trees, barely perceptible against the sound of the water. But now they had grown, louder, clearer, insistent. A chorus of voices that echoed from the depths, rising like a storm that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. The river had always whispered to him, he realized. He had heard the calls as a child, heard them even when he was miles away from Edisto. But he'd dismissed them. He had forgotten them. Now they were impossible to ignore. Come closer, join us. The voices didn't come from the air. They came from the water, from beneath the surface. His heart thudded in his chest as the whispers wrapped themselves around him like cold tendrils, slithering into his mind. The serpent was near. Zack's eyes darted to the water, heart pounding as he saw the surface shift, as if something massive was moving beneath him, just out of sight. The water was dark, unnaturally so, and the shadows it cast seemed to ripple with a life of their own, as if the water itself were alive, breathing, watching. Something was there, something that shouldn't be, something waiting. "Did you see that?" Zack asked, his voice strangled, though the words barely reached his friends in the boat. Madison and Jordan looked up, confused, their laughter faltering. But their gazes soon shifted to the water, scanning the dark surface where Zack's eyes were fixed. "What's wrong, Zack?" Madison asked. Her voice was light, but there was an edge of unease creeping into it. But Zack didn't respond. He was too busy watching the water, watching the way it swirled, the way it moved, unnaturally. His throat tightened as the shadows in the water seemed to gather, coiling, undulating in a way that wasn't just caused by the current. And then the surface broke. It was sudden, a violent explosion of water that sent waves crashing into the boat, sending it rocking dangerously from side to side. Zack felt the cold spray hit his face. But it wasn't just the chill of the water that made his skin crawl. It was the feeling, that primal sensation, like the world around him was no longer safe. Something was emerging from the depths, and then he saw it. A dark shape rose slowly from the water, its massive form twisting and undulating like a living nightmare. A head, crowned with spiny ridges, broke the surface, followed by a body, long, serpentine, and impossibly large. Zack's breath caught in his throat as he saw the creature's glowing yellow eyes fix on him, unblinking, and filled with an ancient, unyielding hunger. The serpent. It was real. Zack couldn't tear his eyes away from it, his body frozen in place, though every instinct screamed for him to move, to flee. The serpent's body coiled in the water like a giant dark rope, rippling and twisting, its scales gleaming black as they caught the dying light of the sun. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, each one as long as Zack's forearm, gleaming in the dull light like a row of knives. "No!" Zack whispered to himself, but the word was lost in the chaos that erupted around him. The serpent let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air, through the very water that surrounded them. It was like nothing Zack had ever heard before, inhuman, ancient, and filled with malice. Before he could react, the boat lurched again, sending him sliding across the floor. His heart skipped a beat as Madison screamed, her voice high-pitched with terror. The boat rocked wildly, the river's current tugging at them, dragging them toward the serpent. Zack reached for her, but it was too late. The current was too strong. The serpent's tail lashed out, sending a wave of water over the boat, knocking Madison into the river with a splash. Zack's blood ran cold as he saw her disappear beneath the surface, swallowed by the creature's reach. "Madison!" Zack shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar of the river, the sound of the serpent's body moving through the water like an unstoppable force. He reached out, but the current was already pulling him toward the river's dark heart, away from the place where Madison had fallen. His heart pounded in his chest as panic set in, but before he could think, the boat was capsized, the water pulling him under. For a moment, everything went black. The cold of the river shocked him back to consciousness, and he opened his eyes to find himself plunged deep into the water. It was like a dream, but a nightmare. Dark, oppressive, suffocating. The water was thick, dense, and as he kicked frantically to reach the surface, it felt like something was holding him down, like the river itself was alive, grabbing at him, pulling him deeper into its cold embrace. He broke the surface with a violent gasp, choking on the water as he frantically looked around. The world was spinning, the water around him alive with the serpent's movements. He could feel the pull of the creature beneath him, moving, circling, as if it were waiting for him to make the first mistake. But then, he saw it, a shape in the distance. Jordan. The serpent's massive head loomed over him, but Jordan was already struggling, fighting the current, his eyes wide with terror. But the creature was faster, and before Zack could even call out to him, the serpent's tail lashed out again, striking the water with the force of a tidal wave. Jordan's scream was drowned out by the roar of the river as he was dragged beneath the surface, vanishing into the dark, black depths. The world around Zack seemed to slow. The terror in his chest reached a new peak, his heart hammering in his ribs as his body moved without his command, the current pulling him deeper into the serpent's domain. It wasn't over. He wasn't alone, and the river wasn't finished with him. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices rising from the depths, filled with endless agony. You will never leave. You belong to me. Zack's body jerked in panic, but his arms were too weak to fight against the pull. The water was thick with the serpent's presence, the darkness beneath the surface more suffocating than anything he had ever known. The creature was closing in. He could feel it, its cold, slick scales brushing against his legs as it coiled around him. The serpent rose from the depths again, its massive form breaking the surface like a tidal wave. Zack's vision blurred as it loomed closer, its glowing yellow eyes locking onto him with terrifying precision. No. No, please. Zack's voice cracked, but it didn't matter. His words were lost in the rushing water, in the beast's deafening growl as its jaws opened wide, ready to take its next victim. The serpent lunged forward, and Zack was caught. The world went black. Chapter 5. Beneath the waters. Zack's heart thundered in his chest, his blood a frozen river in his veins. His limbs were paralyzed, each movement sluggish, as if the water itself were clinging to him like a second skin. He couldn't tell how long he had been submerged, how much time had passed, but it felt like hours, maybe longer. The dark depths of the river had swallowed him whole, dragging him deeper into its dark, watery abyss, away from the world he had known. Everything above the surface, the boat, his friends, the sun, had become distant memories, fading into nothingness as the pressure around him grew stronger, more suffocating. There was no light down here, only shadows. But it wasn't just the lack of light that made Zack's heart ache with fear. It was the presence. The water was no longer just water. It was something else. Alive, pulsating with an ancient, evil energy that wrapped itself around Zack like invisible tendrils, pulling him deeper, pulling him into the heart of the curse. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it in his bones, in his very soul. The river was alive and it was hungry. Come closer. The whisper echoed through Zack's mind, low and insistent, like a voice rising from the depths of the river, curling into his thoughts, urging him to give in, to let go. His breath was ragged, his lungs burning as they screamed for air, but the water was everywhere, filling his lungs, choking him. He kicked violently, but the current was too strong. The water had him now, and he wasn't sure if he would ever see the surface again. His eyes flicked open, the water around him cold and thick, and for a moment, he thought he saw something moving beneath him, a shape, massive and undulating, something too big to be real, a shadow, darker than the water itself, swirling below him like the vast undulating body of some great beast. It wasn't the serpent. Not exactly. But it was something that had been waiting beneath the river for a long time. Zach's head spun, his thoughts becoming muddled as the weight of the river pressed down on him. The darkness closed in around him, the water so cold that it seemed to freeze his very soul. His limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if they were made of stone. He was sinking. No, he wasn't sinking. He was being pulled deeper. A ripple broke the stillness, and Zach's pulse quickened. He could feel it then, the presence, not just the river, not just the serpent, but something ancient, something buried in the very bones of the land itself. It was alive. The land itself was alive. The voice, the whispering, the force that had been watching, waiting, it was coming for him. The river had always been hungry, but now it was insatiable, and Zach was its prey. It calls to you. The voice was everywhere now, thick and suffocating, filling his mind with dark promises. He could hear the ripples of the river, each one like a murmur of some great unseen creature. The darkness around him felt like it had weight, like it was pressing against him, suffocating him. And then, through the fog of panic, through the cold that gripped him, he saw it. The serpent. Its massive form rose from the depths like a nightmare made flesh. Its glowing eyes cut through the blackness, fixed on him with an intensity that stole the air from his lungs. The serpent's head broke the surface with a terrible hiss, the sound echoing through the water, reverberating through his very bones. It was massive, its body undulating beneath the water, its scales gleaming black and slick, reflecting the dim light from above. The jaws of the beast opened wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth, too many to count, glistening like knives in the dark. Come closer. The whisper grew louder, insistent, a chorus of voices now, all speaking in unison. Zach's limbs trembled with cold, his body now moving on its own, driven by the sheer terror that gripped him. The serpent's eyes fixed on him with a malevolent gleam, and Zach's mind screamed, but the terror inside him held him still. The water surged violently around him, and before he could react, the serpent struck, its massive body surging toward him with a speed that defied logic. The sheer force of the creature's movement sent a wave of water crashing over him, knocking him off balance, sending him spinning beneath the surface. The serpent's tail lashed out, striking the water with such force that it caused a violent upheaval, the water churning with a violence that Zach had never felt before. He tried to scream, to swim, to fight back, but his body felt too weak, too heavy. The serpent was upon him now, its massive jaws closing in on him, its presence overwhelming. Zach's vision blurred as the creature's form loomed closer, filling his entire world with its darkness, its hunger. The water around him seemed to freeze, the cold creeping into his very soul. "Join us!" The words echoed through his mind like a chant, the voices of the river wrapping themselves around him, pulling him deeper. He fought to breathe, to think, but all he could hear, all he could feel was the water, the serpent, and the hunger. There was no escape, no salvation. He had come too far, too deep into the river's grasp. And then there was a pull, a sharp, sudden tug that nearly tore the breath from him. Something else had grabbed him, pulling him toward the riverbed. Zach's eyes snapped open, and his heart nearly stopped in his chest as he saw it. Something far larger than the serpent, something far darker, a shape. The shape was massive, larger than anything Zach had ever seen, something that had existed in the water long before the serpent had come. It was the river's true hunger, its true heart, an ancient force, older than the land itself. Its tendrils reached out from the depths, cold and slimy, pulling at Zach's limbs, dragging him deeper. The water churned around him, and the creature's eyes glowed yellow, like the serpent's. But they were so much older, so much more ancient, like they had seen the beginning of time itself. Zach's body screamed in agony as he was pulled deeper, his lungs burning for air. But the pull was too much. The water was a heavy weight on him now, dragging him into the heart of the river, into the maw of the creature that lurked beneath. And then in the distance, he saw something else. Lights, flickering, dim, like stars in the blackness of the water. He thought he heard something, a voice, soft and distant, a voice calling to him, a voice that wasn't the river, a voice that was familiar. Zach. "Zack, help me." It was Madison's voice. Her voice cut through the blackness, rising from the depths, filling him with a horrible sense of hope. He tried to swim toward it, tried to fight the pull, to follow her voice, but the water grew colder, thicker, as if the very river had grown jealous of the light she had brought, and it pulled him back, deeper into the dark. The serpent's eyes locked onto his, and Zack knew then, the land would never let him go. The river had always been hungry, and now it had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. There was no escape. And as the river closed in around him, pulling him into its depths, he knew that this was the beginning of something darker than anything he could comprehend. Chapter 6. The depths of despair. The world was sinking. Zack's body felt as though it was being pulled apart by invisible hands, each muscle and bone straining under the weight of the suffocating, overwhelming terror that had swallowed him whole. The very air around him felt heavy, thick with the pressure of something ancient and alive. He had never known fear like this before, not even when he had watched his friends, his closest companions, vanish into the hungry depths of the river. Everything had changed. It wasn't just the serpent that haunted the river. It was the land itself, the very ground, the water, the trees, the wind. Everything was connected, bound together by something old and malevolent, something that had been lurking in the heart of Edisto long before he was born, something that had been waiting. Zack felt it in his chest, the relentless pull, the insatiable hunger that had taken root in the land. It was no longer just a curse. It was a force, an entity that had consumed everything in its path for centuries. It was pulling him deeper into its grasp, twisting and distorting everything he knew into a nightmare he couldn't escape. The water around him felt alive, swirling with a malevolent force that pulled him down into the depths. Zack gasped for air, but the river responded by pushing him further under, as if it were drowning him slowly, savoring every second of his suffering. His legs kicked out weakly, but the current was too strong, too relentless. Every movement felt like a struggle, a desperate attempt to fight off the inevitable. The whispers had never stopped. They had only grown louder, more insistent, filling his mind with their twisted voices, each one speaking in a language he couldn't understand. But somehow, he felt them. They weren't just words. They were thoughts, memories, ancient echoes that resonated deep within him, like the land itself had planted them there, buried in his very soul. "Come closer." Zack's eyes snapped open, his heart thudding in his chest. There it was again, the voice. It was no longer a whisper. It was a presence, a force speaking directly into his mind, pulling him further into the darkness. His mind raced, trying to push away the feeling of the water closing in around him. But there was no escape. The current was too strong. It wants you. Zack couldn't move. His limbs felt like they were made of stone, too heavy, too slow. The cold of the water sank deeper into his bones until he thought he might freeze from the inside out. His vision blurred, the world spinning around him like some twisted, never-ending vortex. He could feel the serpent, its massive form somewhere below, circling, waiting. But it wasn't just the serpent. It was something else, something more ancient, more powerful. Something that had been here long before the serpent had ever slithered from the river's depths. And then, as if in answer to his thoughts, he felt it, a shift, a change in the water, the pressure around him intensifying. The current was not just pulling him, it was guiding him, dragging him towards something he couldn't see but could feel, something alive, something that pulsed in time with the rhythm of his heart, with the beat of the land itself. A shape began to form in the darkness beneath him, something vast and incomprehensible, too large to be real. It was massive, a living thing that filled the water, stretching impossibly far. His breath caught in his throat as the form became clearer, shifting in the blackness like the shadow of some great, nightmarish entity. It was not the serpent. It was bigger. The creature, if it could even be called that, was a massive silhouette beneath the surface, its size so overwhelming that it seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the river itself. Its body was a writhing mass, shifting and undulating in ways that defied all logic. It was not a snake, not an animal. It was something darker, older, a thing that existed beyond comprehension. Its body was an amalgamation of water, flesh, and something unnatural, like it was part of the river itself, part of the very land that had birthed it. "You cannot escape." The voice was there again, louder now, not just in his mind, but in the very water, in the very air around him. The sound reverberated through Zach's skull, shaking his thoughts, clouding his vision. He felt the river's pull again, deeper now, more intense. The cold had spread from his body to his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like chains, pulling him under. The land was claiming him. The darkness deepened. Zach's heart raced, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was something else, a feeling of inevitability. There was no escape from this. The land had been waiting for him. The river had been waiting for him. He had been marked, and now there was no turning back. Zach fought against the water, pushing against the current, but his strength was slipping. His mind was growing foggy, the pressure around him becoming unbearable. The shape beneath him grew closer, its form pressing up against the surface, its presence more tangible now. It was huge, colossal, an ancient horror that had been lurking beneath the river's surface for millennia. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape them. A cold, wet tendril shot out of the water and wrapped itself around Zach's ankle with a force that felt like iron. His body jerked, pulled down deeper into the water, his lungs burning, desperate for air. The tendril tightened, pulling him into the darkness, dragging him toward the black abyss where the creature waited. Zach screamed, his mouth filling with water, but there was no one to hear him, no one to save him. The world spun, twisted, and then nothing. When Zach's mind finally returned to him, he was no longer in the water. He was lying on cold stone, gasping for air, his body trembling, his hands slick with sweat. The air around him was thick, heavy with the scent of decay and dampness. His vision was blurry, his head spinning, but the silence was deafening. The silence was suffocating. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs refused to obey, and when he looked down, he saw that his hands were covered in a thick, dark substance, something sticky and foul, like tar. His breath hitched in his throat as he tried to wipe it away, but the more he moved, the more the substance seemed to cling to him, as though it were part of him now, as though it had seeped into his very skin. "What is this?" he whispered, but his voice sounded distant, as though someone else were speaking. A faint light flickered in the distance, and Zach squinted, trying to focus. The light was dim, pale, flickering like a dying flame. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed himself to his feet, stumbling toward it. He had to get out of here. He had to find a way to escape. But as he moved toward the light, something shifted behind him. The water. It was moving. Zach turned just in time to see the river's surface ripple, as if something had disturbed it from beneath. A shape emerged from the darkness, larger than anything Zach had ever seen. It was the serpent, but it wasn't just the serpent anymore. It had grown, evolved into something far worse. Its massive body, once sleek and sinuous, now looked bloated, swollen, like it was bursting at the seams. Its eyes were no longer the familiar yellow. They had turned black, swirling with an abyssal emptiness. It was feeding. Zach stumbled back, his heart racing as the serpent's eyes locked onto him. The creature's mouth opened wide, its cavernous throat stretching impossibly large, ready to consume him whole. Its hunger was insatiable. The river had called him. And now it would take him. Chapter 7. The curse awakened. Zach's body felt weightless, suspended in the cold abyss. His vision swam in a dizzying spiral of black and murky water, blurring with each pulse of pain that raced through him. The land, the river, the very essence of Edisto had claimed him, and now he understood. There was no escape. The serpent had him. Not just in the physical sense, but in a far deeper way. Its presence had infected his mind, his very soul. The moment he entered the water, it had marked him, beckoned him into its fold. The hunger was real. The curse had been waiting for him, for someone, and now it was beginning to feed. Slowly, methodically, it was devouring everything in him. His will, his memories, his very sense of self. The world around him was silent, save for the steady rhythmic pulse of the water. His breath was shallow, though he wasn't entirely sure if it was the air or the water that suffocated him. The darkness pressed in on him, oppressive and suffocating, as if the very ground, the earth, had grown tired of its centuries-long slumber and was beginning to stir. "Come closer." The voice was softer now, more insistent, but it wasn't the serpent speaking. No, this voice was older, deeper, inhuman. It was the river, the land, the ancient force that had laid in wait for countless generations. It had chosen him. Zack was no longer a man. He was a part of it, a part of the land's insatiable hunger. The whispers had become more than just voices. They were feelings, impressions, overwhelming sensations that flooded his mind, drowning out all coherent thought. There was no thought, only a gnawing hunger, an unbearable pull towards something darker, deeper, ancient beyond understanding. Zack struggled to regain control of his thoughts, to fight the overwhelming tide that threatened to pull him under completely. He had to move, had to get away. But his body betrayed him. Every movement felt sluggish, unnatural, as though the land itself had reached into him and paralyzed him, freezing him in place. The cold had worked its way into his bones, settling there like a sickness, numbing him from the inside out. He was alive, but barely, and as the water enveloped him, he began to realize that it was the land that was the true predator, the true hunger. He tried to scream, but only bubbles escaped his mouth, the sound swallowed by the vast open maw of the water around him. The pressure on his chest was unbearable, and each breath felt like a struggle to stay alive. But as the water closed in on him, Zack's mind began to fracture. The whispers, the pull, the sinking sensation, it all felt wrong, unnatural. He was no longer sure if he was even breathing, if he was still himself. The serpent's enormous form loomed just beyond his vision, its glowing eyes like the sun itself, distant yet fixed, unblinking. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating, but it wasn't the serpent that had him now. It was the land, the river. The land wanted him. The land had always wanted him. The serpent had risen from the river like an ancient god, its great coils slicing through the water like living mountains, its eyes burning with a hunger Zack couldn't comprehend. But as it moved, it wasn't the serpent that haunted him now. It was the land's true face, the ancient force that stretched beyond the serpent, beyond the river, beyond the very earth beneath his feet. It was something older, something far darker. Zack gasped in horror as his body was suddenly pulled downward, deeper into the black abyss. The weight of the water pressed in from all sides, but it wasn't the water alone that dragged him under. It was the river's will. He could feel it, its presence pushing against him, pulling him deeper, as if the earth itself were taking hold of him. The current had intensified, rushing past him with terrifying speed, dragging him downward with a force that made it impossible to fight back. "You cannot leave." The voice came again, clearer now, as though it were a chorus of voices speaking from within him. There was no escaping it now. The water closed over his head, and Zack was plunged into an unimaginable darkness, the world around him swallowed by the black void. But in the darkness, something stirred, a light. It flickered at first, a dim, distant glow. Zack strained to see it, his eyes aching from the cold, but there it was, something out there, something beyond the blackness. It was faint, but unmistakable. The light pulsed, and with each pulse, Zack felt the pull of it, the lure, as though the light was calling him home. He fought the current, struggling to swim toward it, but it was like trying to swim through molasses. The water was thick, dense, suffocating, but the light beckoned him forward, and despite the pressure on his chest, despite the weight of the world dragging him down, he moved. And then, with a final surge, his hands broke through the surface. For a moment, there was silence, complete and utter silence, as if the world itself were holding its breath. His hands scraped across rough stone, cold and slick, like wet skin. He gasped, lungs burning, taking in the air in desperate, violent breaths. The light was clearer now, and he realized with a growing sense of terror that it wasn't the surface of the water he had broken through. It was something else. Something older, something from the deep places of the world. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, Zach's heart seized in his chest. He was standing in a cavern, vast and ancient. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot, and the walls around him pulsed like living flesh, slick and moving. His eyes scanned the cavern, and he realized that the walls weren't just stone. They were alive. The very cavern itself was breathing, its pulse in time with the land's hunger. It is time. The voice was clearer now, deeper, coming from all around him, echoing in his mind. The ground beneath him quivered, as though the earth itself had begun to stir, and he felt the weight of it, the terrible weight of something ancient, something beyond his understanding. Then he saw them, the figures, hundreds of them. At first, Zach thought they were statues, or the remnants of some ancient civilization long lost to time. But as his eyes focused, he saw the truth. They were bodies. Thousands of bodies, their forms contorted and twisted, their eyes wide open in eternal terror. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their faces frozen in expressions of horror. Their bodies fused to the walls, to the ground, as though the land itself had taken them and made them part of its endless hunger. You are not alone. Zach's mind reeled. His vision blurred as his heart beat harder, faster. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The darkness closed in around him, and he felt the pressure of the land's hunger tightening, drawing him into its endless grip. His body was shaking, his skin cold with fear, as the walls seemed to close in on him. And then, the light flickered again. It was faint, so far away, but it was there. A voice. Help me! Zach's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the voice. It was Madison. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His heart skipped a beat. She was still alive. She had to be. Somehow she had been dragged down here too, to the very heart of the curse, to the belly of the land. Zach's body moved on instinct, ignoring the sharp pain in his chest, ignoring the way the very earth seemed to pull at his limbs, urging him to stop, to stay. But he couldn't stop. He had to save her. He had to find a way to fight. The cavern stretched before him, an endless expanse of darkness and light, of death and hunger. The voice of the land rose again, a terrible chorus that echoed in his ears. You belong to me now. But Zach's heart burned with a single thought. No. Zach pushed forward, through the thick darkness, his body screaming in protest, his mind fighting the pull of the land's hunger. The figure in the distance, the glowing figure, was close now, too close. His heart raced as the light grew brighter, clearer. He was almost there. He could save her. And then, just as the darkness threatened to swallow him whole, he stepped forward into the light, and the ground gave way. Chapter 8. The Hollow Heart. Zach's mind felt fractured, as if the moment he had been pulled into the depths of the river, a part of his very soul had been severed, leaving him adrift in the darkness. The earth beneath him felt like soft flesh, pulsing with a sinister life of its own. His skin crawled as though something unseen was slithering beneath it, twisting into his veins, sinking into his bones. He could feel it, the land, alive with hunger. It was pulling at him, wrapping itself around him, and there was no escape. He wasn't just trapped in the water anymore. He was inside the land, swallowed whole by a curse so ancient it felt like it had been waiting for him from the very beginning. His body ached, his muscles sore from the relentless struggle of survival. But there was no place to rest, no place to hide from the suffocating grip of the river. The land had grown hungry, and now it was turning that hunger toward him. He gasped for air, but the very atmosphere around him seemed thick, heavy, as if the very air was alive, choking him, filling his lungs with the suffocating pull of the curse. Every breath felt like a battle, every moment a fight to hold on to his sanity. Zach pushed himself upright, his limbs trembling, the ground beneath him slick and shifting. The cavern was larger than he had thought, stretching out endlessly in all directions. The walls, if they could even be called walls, were not stone or earth. They were flesh. The surface pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, as though the land itself was alive, breathing in time with his own heartbeat. The texture beneath his hands was wet, slick, and it stuck to his skin as if the very earth was trying to claim him. His mind spun with the realization. This wasn't a cave. It wasn't even the land as he had known it. This was something else. This was a place where the boundaries between life and death, between the living and the consumed, were blurred, where the land itself fed. A sickening, nauseating stench filled his nostrils, so foul that it made him gag. It was the smell of rot, of decay, but there was something deeper to it, something ancient. The air was thick with the smell of something dead, something that had been buried here long before his arrival. Zack's eyes darted around, but there was no light. The cavern, if it could be called that, was bathed in a faint, sickly glow that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The darkness was not empty. It was alive, thrumming with an unseen force, something that clawed at him from the edges of his mind. And then he saw them, figures. At first they were just shapes, indistinct and blurred in the faint, sickly light. But as Zack's eyes adjusted, they took form. Dozens of them, hundreds. Human figures, their bodies twisted and contorted in grotesque shapes, hanging from the walls of the cavern like ragged marionettes, their faces frozen in a silent scream, their mouths gaping in agony. Their skin was pale and stretched thin, the veins beneath visible like living corpses suspended in the air, their bodies fused to the very walls around them. It was as if the land itself had consumed them, had turned them into part of its insatiable hunger. Zack's breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest as the horrific realization dawned on him. These were not statues. These were not relics of the past. These were people. People who had been claimed by the land, like him. He stepped back, his legs shaking, but his eyes were drawn to one figure in particular. A woman, her body twisted into an unnatural position, her face contorted in agony, but her eyes were wide open, staring at him. Zack's heart skipped a beat as he looked into her eyes, familiar eyes that he recognized. Madison. He couldn't breathe. His mind screamed for him to look away, to deny what his eyes were seeing, but he couldn't tear himself away. Madison's eyes locked onto his, her mouth working as though she were trying to scream, but no sound came. She was still alive. Or at least, she had been. Her body had been consumed, turned into part of the land, but she was still there, still conscious in some twisted way. Zack's chest tightened as he staggered toward her, his feet slipping on the slick, pulsing ground. He reached out a trembling hand, but the land itself seemed to pull at him, to drag him back. The very air seemed to resist him, pressing against him, pushing him into the ground. The land was alive, and it was hungry. It wanted him just as it had wanted her. He could feel it now, the land's insatiable hunger, growing stronger with every passing second. It wasn't just a hunger for the body, it was a hunger for the soul. The land fed on their pain, on their terror, and it was waiting for him to join them. To become part of the land, part of the hunger. The whispers came again, louder now, swirling around him like a storm. They were everywhere, inside him, outside him, speaking in unison, their voices twisting together into an unbearable cacophony. Join us, become part of us. The words drilled into his mind, sharper than any knife, like they were tearing into his very thoughts, forcing him to listen. His chest tightened, his breath caught in his throat. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the dark, suffocating presence around him. Zack's knees buckled, and he fell to the ground. The cavern seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing against him, suffocating him. He could feel the earth beneath him, alive, breathing, pulling at him. The ground seemed to stretch, to shift, like it was alive, like it was a part of him, a part of them. And in that moment, as the hunger consumed him, he understood. He had been marked the moment he had set foot on Edisto. The river had claimed him long ago, and now it was ready to consume him entirely. His heart raced, but there was no escaping it. The land had taken Madison. It had taken Jordan. It had taken everything. And now it was coming for him. The walls closed in tighter, and he could feel the coldness, the suffocating weight of the earth pressing down on him. "Please, help me." Her voice, Madison's voice, cut through the haze of terror, sharp and clear. She was still here, still alive in some way. His heart broke as he reached out toward her, his hand trembling as he touched the surface of the wall, just inches from where her eyes were fixed. He could feel her pain, her terror, like it was his own. She wasn't just trapped in the earth. She was part of it now. Part of the curse that had claimed them all. Zach's mind screamed for him to break free, to escape, but his body was too weak, too numb. The hunger of the land had taken hold of him, and there was no turning back. He could feel it, the very ground beneath him pulling him in, dragging him toward the dark, twisted heart of the cavern, the source of it all, the thing that had given birth to the curse. The darkness around him grew colder, thicker. The whispers grew louder. The walls seemed to close in. Join us. Become part of us. Zach could feel the land sinking into him, filling him with its hunger, its darkness. His body trembled, his skin crawling as the power of the land surged through him. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw Madison's face, her eyes wide and filled with terror, fading, as if she were being consumed by the very land that had taken her. But then, as he felt his mind slip away, as the hunger began to swallow him whole, he saw something else. A light, a flicker of warmth, and just for a moment, a voice. "Zach, fight!" The light flickered again, and Zach's body jerked. The earth trembled, the cavern shifting, as though the land itself was reacting to his struggle. The walls cracked, the ground groaning, but the pull was still there, pulling at him, dragging him deeper. The hunger hadn't stopped. It was just beginning. Chapter 9. The Last Echoes. Zach's heart pounded so violently it seemed to echo through every fiber of his being. His chest was tight with terror, his breath ragged and shallow as the overwhelming weight of the land pressed in from all sides. His limbs felt like lead, every movement a struggle against the grip of the earth that seemed to have a life of its own. The ground beneath him pulsed, throbbed with the hunger of something far older than he was, far more ancient and insatiable. He was no longer in control of his own body. He was simply a passenger, trapped in a vessel that was being consumed by the earth itself. The light flickered again, a brief, fragile spark that fought to hold back the ever-encroaching darkness. Zach's mind was clouded, his thoughts muddled by the constant barrage of whispers that had now become a constant presence. They didn't come from anywhere tangible. They came from the land, the river, the curse. They were inside his head, inside his soul, gnawing at him, urging him to join them, to become one with the hunger. Zach's vision blurred as the walls around him seemed to stretch, the cavern breathing with a rhythm that matched his own pulse. He could feel it in the air, the ground beneath him, in every fiber of his being. The land was feeding. It had already taken so much. The figures, those hollow, twisted remnants of people who had been claimed by the river and the land, were staring at him with hollow eyes, their faces locked in expressions of eternal agony. Their souls were trapped, like prisoners, woven into the very fabric of the earth. They were the land's sacrifice, its offering to the never-ending hunger. And soon, Zach would join them. The walls around him groaned as if the earth itself was shifting, preparing to devour him. The pulsing, the thrum of the cavern's heartbeat grew louder, growing in intensity as the dark energy around him coiled tighter. He had felt it once, the way the earth seemed to breathe, to hunger. But now, it was different, more urgent, more alive. The land wasn't just feeding on fear, it was driven to feed, as though it had been starved for centuries. Zach's mind reeled, his breath becoming more erratic, as the panic inside him reached a fever pitch. He tried to pull away, to break free from the ground's grip, but the more he struggled, the tighter it seemed to hold him. His arms and legs were being pulled downward, as though the very earth wanted to swallow him whole. The ground was swallowing him whole. His pulse quickened as the whispers turned to words, their voices clear now, sharp and distinct, filling his mind with their terrible promise. "You belong to us." Zach's chest tightened, his lungs burning as he tried to scream, to push the words away. But there was no sound, No escape. The voices surrounded him, inside him, sinking into his flesh, pulling him down, down into the heart of the land. The darkness closed in tighter, suffocating him, drowning him in the weight of the curse. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. Then he felt it. A touch, cold and slimy, like the fingers of the river, like the earth had reached out and grasped his soul. His body jerked, his eyes flying open as he felt something, someone moving beside him. The figure, Madison, her pale face, her wide eyes, locked onto his. She was still alive, still there, but her expression was hollow. Her eyes were empty, her body suspended in the cavern, still bound to the earth, but her spirit, her soul, was gone. The light in her eyes was fading. The land had consumed her, and it was in the process of consuming Zack too. "Madison," Zack whispered, his voice shaking, his body trembling as he reached toward her, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. But his hand couldn't move further. The land held him back, preventing him from reaching her. He was powerless. He was a part of it now. The ground beneath him shifted again, the earth groaning as it pressed in from all sides, suffocating him, consuming him. He could feel the land taking him, its hunger wrapping around him, clawing at his soul. The darkness grew deeper, the whispers louder. They weren't just voices, they were thoughts, ideas, feelings, and they swirled in his mind like a storm. "Join us, become one with the land, become one with the hunger." Zack shook his head violently, his mind fighting the pull, but it was futile. The earth, the land, the curse, they had him. There was no escaping it. He was already part of it, part of the never-ending hunger that stretched through the river, through the trees, through the very heart of Edisto. It was alive, and it had always been alive. He could feel the pull of the river again, faint but unmistakable, tugging at his very soul. The serpent's eyes, those burning yellow orbs, flashed in his mind, the reminder of the creature that had claimed his friends. But it wasn't just the serpent. No, it was something far worse. The serpent had been merely the guardian, a servant to the curse, to the land itself. And now Zack could feel it, the true force, the true horror that lay beneath. Zack's mind reeled with the images that flooded him, the memories of the past, of Daniel's death, of his guilt, of the times he had spent with his friends, unaware of the land's hunger, unaware of the curse that had claimed them all. It had been here, waiting, hunting, for centuries. It had consumed them all. The land was alive, and it was hungry. "Help me." Madison's voice echoed in his mind, but the words were hollow, filled with desperation. She wasn't just trapped. She had become part of the land. She was no longer herself. She was lost, just as he was losing himself. Suddenly, the walls around him pulsed again, and Zack's body jerked. The ground beneath him cracked open, a deep, hollow sound reverberating through the cavern. The black void beneath him seemed to swallow everything in its path, pulling at him, dragging him closer to the pit. His heart raced, his pulse quickening as the earth itself seemed to move, shifting beneath him, opening its massive jaws to consume him. He had no strength left to fight. The river had claimed him, the land had claimed him, the hunger had claimed him. But then there was a flash, a flicker of light, a memory, a voice. "Fight, Zack! Don't give in!" The voice was familiar. He recognized it. It was Jordan's. For a brief moment, a surge of hope pierced through the crushing despair, the fog that had taken over his mind. The earth, the land, it could have him. But he could fight it. He could survive. With every ounce of strength, Zack pushed against the pull, against the suffocating grip of the land. The whispers, the hunger, they were all around him. But for a single moment, he felt a surge of resistance, a spark of his own will. He wasn't completely lost. Not yet. The light flickered again, more persistent this time, growing brighter, stronger. He could feel it. His soul was still his own. He wasn't completely consumed yet. "I'm not done." His voice was a raspy whisper, a mere breath against the overwhelming pressure of the land. But as he spoke, the earth trembled beneath him, the walls around him groaning as if they had heard him, as if they were reacting to him. The hunger flared, but so did his will. And in that moment, Zack understood. The land had been waiting for him, yes, but it wasn't invincible. Not completely. He could fight back. With a final desperate cry, Zack pushed against the earth, against the land, against everything that had tried to claim him. The ground cracked beneath him, the cavern shook, and for a split second he felt the land recoil, as if it had been shocked, stunned by the force of his resistance. And then, with a terrifying roar, everything went dark. Chapter 9. The Last Echoes. The land was alive. Zack had always known the river to be an ancient, relentless force. It pulled at the very soul, beckoned the unsuspecting into its depths. But it was never just the water that was dangerous. He had learned that lesson too late. It was the land, the flesh beneath his feet, that truly held the power. It was not a simple hunger, a need for survival. No, this was something darker, more ancient than anything he could have imagined. The earth, the river, the very air around him had conspired to drag him into this suffocating, malevolent force. He felt the weight of it now, the hunger of the earth gnawing at him from every direction. His legs trembled beneath him, his arms weak and unresponsive as the pulse of the land surged beneath him. It wasn't just the cavern that had changed, it was everything. The walls of the cave, which had once seemed like stone, now felt alive, soft and slick with the residue of something dark, something beyond comprehension. They pulsed with an eerie rhythm, as if they were breathing, as though the cavern itself had taken a breath and was preparing to feast on him. Zack's breath was shallow, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The air was thick, so thick it felt as though he was suffocating in it. He tried to push himself up, but the ground beneath him seemed to reach for him, as though it had grown tendrils of its own, grabbing at his limbs, pulling him back into its grip. The land was taking him. It was taking everything he had, his thoughts, his life, his soul. It's too late. The words echoed in his mind, soft and insistent. He tried to ignore them, to fight them off, but the more he struggled, the stronger the land's grip became. The whispers, the voices, were all around him now, swirling in his mind like a storm, louder than ever. They were the land's thoughts, the land's hunger, all speaking at once, a chorus of ancient voices that filled his head with unbearable noise. He could feel them in his bones, in his veins. The land was speaking to him, calling to him, telling him that there was no escape. Join us. Zack squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the voices only grew louder, more insistent. The pressure on his chest increased, and his body felt like it was being crushed beneath the weight of the land. He could feel the earth beneath him shifting, moving, pulling him deeper into its hunger. There was no escape. There was nowhere to run. You will be part of us. His mind screamed in defiance, but his body betrayed him. The ground beneath him seemed to open, a chasm of darkness stretching before him, yawning wide like the mouth of some monstrous beast, waiting to swallow him whole. The land was claiming him. It had already claimed Madison, Jordan, and every other soul foolish enough to wander too close to the river. Now, it would claim him. His chest tightened, and his pulse quickened as the world around him shifted, the cavern bending and twisting. The walls of the cavern seemed to stretch, folding inward, pulling him closer to the heart of the land. Zack's eyes opened again, and the darkness seemed to rush toward him like a wave, crashing over him, swallowing everything. The cavern became a blur of shapes, shadows, and movement. And in the middle of it all, he saw her, Madison. Her face, pale and twisted in agony, stared back at him from the darkness. Her eyes were wide open, but there was no recognition in them. She had become part of the land, part of the hunger. She had been absorbed into the very fabric of the earth, her body bound to it like the others before her. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, but there was no sound, no escape. She was lost, trapped forever in the abyss of the land's curse. Zack's breath hitched in his throat, his heart shattering for her. But there was nothing he could do. The land had taken her. It had taken all of them. And now, it was coming for him. His body shook with a cold he couldn't escape. But it wasn't just the physical chill of the cavern. It was the chill of despair. His soul was being drained, consumed by the land, by the river, by the very hunger that had claimed everything. It wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for existence, for his very being. The land was not just taking his body, it was taking his soul. He had no strength left to resist. The land's hunger was too much, too overwhelming, and the more he struggled, the more it pressed down on him, pulling him deeper into the black abyss. He was sinking, falling, as the earth swallowed him whole. But then, a voice. Not the voices of the land, not the whispers that had consumed him. This voice was different. It was familiar. Zack. The sound of his name, soft, desperate, like a hand reaching out in the darkness. His body jerked, his heart skipping a beat as he turned, his eyes straining to find the source. But there was no one there. The darkness was too thick, too suffocating. "Madison," he whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. And then, another voice. This time, it was Jordan. "You're not alone, Zack. Fight." The words pierced the fog of his thoughts, cutting through the haze of the land's hunger. For a moment, a spark of recognition flared inside him. Jordan. Madison. They weren't just gone. They were here, somewhere. Their souls hadn't been fully consumed. There was still a chance. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble as if the land itself had sensed his defiance, had felt the flicker of resistance inside him. Zack's heart thundered in his chest, his breath ragged, but he pushed against the pull of the earth, against the overwhelming weight of the hunger. He wasn't finished yet. With a final, desperate surge of will, he pushed himself to his feet, his legs weak, his body trembling, but his mind clear. The walls of the cavern pressed in on him, the darkness closing around him, but he focused, ignoring the pull of the land's hunger. He reached out toward the light, toward the glimmer of hope that flickered ahead. The whispers were louder now, more forceful, filling his mind with their terrible demands. But he ignored them. He fought them. He could still feel Madison's presence, her soul struggling beneath the earth's suffocating grip. He could still feel Jordan, a faint echo, a whisper of their strength. And then, a crack. The ground beneath him split open with a deafening roar. The earth trembled violently, shaking as if in protest. Zack's body was flung back as the cavern began to collapse around him, the walls groaning, the earth screaming in fury as if it could no longer bear the weight of his resistance. But Zack didn't stop. He couldn't stop. In the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the shaking, the cracking, the rumbling, he saw the light. It was growing brighter, clearer, burning with the energy of the earth itself. He stumbled toward it, his vision swimming, but his resolve clear. "Zack!" The voice was clearer now. "Madison." The light enveloped him, and he stepped forward, his heart racing in his chest as the land recoiled. The light was tearing through the darkness, unraveling the hold the land had on him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Zack felt free. The hunger, the land, the voices, they were fading, their grip loosening. And then, as the light consumed him, he understood. He wasn't just fighting the land, he was fighting for them, for everyone who had been lost. And with each step he took, he could feel them, their presence, their whispers of hope, fighting to pull him from the depths. But the land wasn't finished. Not yet. The final battle had just begun. Chapter 10. The Final Descent. Zack's body felt like it was moving through a dream. Distant, heavy, and not entirely his own. The earth beneath his feet trembled, its pulse echoing through his bones, the hollow thrum of something alive, something ancient. The whispers were louder now, surrounding him, filling the space with their endless chorus. They weren't just voices. They were thoughts, memories, fragments of lives long extinguished, all buried beneath the weight of the curse. "You belong to us." The words reverberated through his skull, an unbearable pressure pressing in on his mind, suffocating him with the weight of the land's hunger. His chest felt tight, his breath shallow as he struggled to make sense of the chaos surrounding him. The light, faint, flickering, had begun to fade, dimming in the face of the encroaching darkness. The cavern that had once seemed like a tomb now felt like a living, breathing thing, closing in around him, tightening its grip with each passing second. Zack stumbled forward, his legs unsteady, his feet slipping on the slick, pulsating ground. His hands grasped at the walls for support, but the earth recoiled under his touch, pulling away as though it had a life of its own. He was fighting the land, fighting the curse, fighting for his very soul. But with each step he took, the darkness grew stronger, more oppressive, like the land itself was determined to crush him beneath its weight. He could feel the presence of Madison and Jordan in his mind, their voices a distant echo, their energy struggling against the suffocating pull of the land's hunger. They were trapped, lost in the same endless cycle, consumed by the curse of Edisto. But they weren't gone. They couldn't be gone. Not yet. Not if there was any chance to break this. His chest tightened as his thoughts raced. The serpent had shown him its true nature, a guardian, a servant to the hunger of the land. But it was more than that. The land itself was alive, and it had been waiting for him, for someone to feed its endless hunger. It had consumed them. It was consuming him. And soon, it would consume everything, until there was nothing left but the hunger. Zach's heart thundered in his chest as the earth around him shifted again, the walls cracking, groaning with the weight of centuries of decay. The sound was deafening, an unholy symphony that echoed through the cavern, filling his mind with the knowledge of what was to come. The land was awakening, rising from the depths of the river, from the very core of Edisto. It had been asleep for too long, and now it was time to feed again. The floor beneath him trembled, and the earth seemed to split apart, revealing a yawning chasm, a deep, black void that stretched downward into the unknown. The land had claimed so much already, and now it was reaching for him, pulling him toward the very heart of the curse. He felt the force of it in his chest, like a physical weight pushing down on him, suffocating him with its presence. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of the chasm, Zach saw it, the heart of the land. It was not a physical thing. It was something else, something far older than the serpent, than the river, than even the land itself. It was a presence, a force that filled the cavern, pulsing with a dark, malevolent energy. Its form was indistinct, shifting, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. But its power was undeniable. It was the source of the land's hunger, the force that had shaped everything around him, the thing that had pulled him into this nightmare. "It's too late," the voice whispered again, louder this time, filling his mind with the certainty of his fate. "You belong to us. You will feed us." Zach's hands shook as he reached for the edge of the chasm, his fingers scraping against the cold, smooth stone. His body was weak, trembling with exhaustion, but his will burned brighter than ever. He couldn't give up. He couldn't let the land win. He wouldn't let the land take him. With a final, desperate effort, Zach forced himself forward, his feet slipping on the slick, damp ground. The cavern seemed to close in around him, the darkness pressing against his body, urging him to give in. The whispers were deafening now, their words insistent, promising him release, promising him peace. But there was no peace in the land's hunger, only consumption, only endless pain. And then, just as the darkness seemed to swallow him whole, something shifted. A voice, a real voice. Zach. It was Madison. Zach's eyes snapped open, his heart leaping in his chest. The earth trembled again, the land shaking as if reacting to the presence of her voice. She was still here. She was still alive. Somewhere in the depths, fighting against the curse that had taken her. His heart swelled with hope, a surge of warmth in the cold, oppressive air. "Zach, you have to fight. You're the only one who can stop it." Zach closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, willing himself to focus. The cavern seemed to pulse around him, the darkness growing deeper, but he could hear her voice, clear and strong, calling him to move. He could feel her presence, faint but undeniable, like a thread of light in the darkness. He wasn't alone. The ground trembled again, and Zach's eyes snapped open, a surge of adrenaline flooding his body. The chasm before him seemed to stretch even wider, but this time, he didn't feel the same sense of inevitability. He didn't feel the suffocating weight of the land's hunger. He felt her, Madison. "Don't give up." With every ounce of strength he could muster, Zach surged forward, his legs unsteady but determined. The earth seemed to resist him, pulling at his limbs, dragging him toward the abyss. But he fought back. He had to, for Madison, for Jordan, for everyone who had fallen into the land's cursed grasp. The walls of the cavern cracked open, and the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. But Zack's resolve burned brighter. He wasn't going to die here. He wasn't going to become a part of the land's endless hunger. And then, as if in response to his defiance, the ground beneath him cracked open, and a torrent of light flooded the cavern, breaking through the darkness. Zack gasped as the light washed over him, and for the first time he felt a sense of peace. The earth no longer felt like it was pressing in on him. The hunger, the pull, the darkness, they were fading. The land was recoiling, retreating from the light that had broken through its heart. You can't escape. The voice echoed, but it was weak, fading into the distance as the light grew stronger. The land's hunger had been defeated, but not completely. Zack had bought them time, and with that time he could fight. He could save Madison. He could save himself. With the light as his guide, he stepped forward, his heart steady, his resolve unwavering. The land had claimed many before him, but it would not claim him, not today.